My aunt stole my inheritance, and the law of cause and effect hit her in the worst way possible. Her life completely fell apart, and now she lives in a minivan. My aunt was one of the two children my grandparents had. My mother was the complete opposite of my aunt. She worked in my grandfather's store from the age of 12, never asked for anything, and eventually managed to open her own business. My aunt, on the other hand, did not hold a job until she was 26, always stole from her parents, and constantly got into trouble. Despite this, my grandmother spoiled her and her children. She had 3 children with 3 different men, and her first husband was not one of them, if you know what I mean. No matter what my aunt or her children did, my grandmother always defended them. She never had time for my mother and us unless it was to get something from us. The only reason my mother visited was because she loved my grandfather. My grandfather passed away in 2004, and a few months later, my grandmother decided to draft a new will. My mother and my aunt were present when she signed it, so they knew what it contained. It stipulated that when she passed away, her house would be sold and the money would be divided, 25% to my mother, 25% to my aunt, and the remaining 50% to be split equally among the grandchildren. At the time, the house was worth over $500,000, so it was a considerable inheritance but would not change anyone's life. In 2010, my mother died in an accident and did not have a current will. She no longer had her business and was renting a house, so she did not have anything of much monetary value. The only thing she cared about was what would be done at her funeral if she passed away. She had told me everything she wanted: the music, the flowers, the color of the coffin, and even how she wanted people to dress at the funeral. She wanted people to wear bright, warm colors. When she passed away, my aunt and grandmother took care of all the arrangements and tried to undo everything I told them. The songs were going to be ones I knew my mother did not like, the flowers were all the wrong colors, and they chose an awful coffin. With the help of my siblings, we managed to change some things back to what they were supposed to be, but for some reason, the coffin could not be changed, and my grandmother refused to let people dress like clowns, so everything was black. It was frustrating. After the funeral, my grandmother changed her will. My siblings and I were informed by our aunt that she had no part in drafting the will, and our grandmother told us she changed it so that my mother's share would go to her children instead. Fine, we thought. After my mother passed away, my grandmother stopped talking about her. At first, we thought it was because she was still recovering from the loss of her daughter, but even 5 years after my mother's death, she still did not talk about her. Even if you mentioned a story about my mother, my grandmother would try to change the subject very obviously, usually to how hard my aunt and her children had it. And if you talked to her about your own problems, she would somehow bring it back to my aunt. After my mother's death, I had a mental breakdown, so you can imagine how much it hurt to hear, well, X has had it much worse. In 2016, my grandmother passed away. She had written what she wanted to be done for her funeral, and it was basically the same things she had chosen for my mother's funeral, even the music. I do not know why she tried to have a rehearsal for the funeral using my mother as the stand-in, but it was obvious what she was trying to do. After a few months, my siblings and I were waiting to hear about the reading of the will, and my aunt kept telling us, "Go, it will be another month before we can do the reading." I did not care. I was not worried about the money, to be honest. But my older brother was hoping to use the money to pay for a honeymoon for him and his then-fiancée, and my younger brother was about to start college, so it would have been a big help. Eventually, my father met with the lawyer who handled my grandmother's will and asked what was going on. The lawyer let slip that the will had already been read and that everything was left to my aunt. When my father questioned this, my aunt eventually admitted to lying to us all. She showed us the will and it confirmed what we already knew. We fought it in court, but everyone we talked to said we probably would not get anything. She immediately put the house up for sale for almost $750,000. She had angered too many people in our town, so she was going to sell the house and move near her daughter, who lived in a big city. An offer was made on the house, and she paid a deposit for a house near the big city, and I thought that was that. This is where the law of cause and effect comes in. The people who wanted my grandmother's house did an inspection to see if there were any problems, and oh boy, there were. It turns out the land the house was built on was too soft for the type of house it was, and it was sinking. It had sunk about 40 feet over the 40-plus years my grandparents had lived there, but the sinking was accelerating at 1 centimeter per year. This meant that within the next 3 years, the house would need serious repairs or be demolished. The new value of the house was $60,000. The buyers immediately backed out without even putting a deposit. She could not buy her new house but still had to pay the deposit. Meanwhile, she let Clive move in with her at the house she was renting from the council. He was not allowed to live in any of the council houses because he had wrecked every one they had given him. Someone reported this, and she was evicted from her house. She was forced to move into my grandmother's old house and could not live anywhere else. So there she was, living in a crumbling house with her useless son and her partner. She was stuck there for 2 years. Every time I saw her, she tried to talk to me, and I just ignored her and walked away. Once, as I was walking away, she shouted, "Your mother deserved to die for having an idiot like you," in the middle of a busy street. Someone reported her to the police, and she received an official warning from them and was ridiculed on Facebook. Each time I saw her after that, she looked more and more miserable. Eventually, she sold the house for about $85,000 and moved in with her daughter in the big city. I lost contact with her and her children after that. I thought the law of cause and effect had already taken care of her, but it was not done yet. I ran into one of her former friends, and they told me what happened. After she left our town, she moved into her daughter's house, let's call her Sue. But they only had a 3-bedroom house and 3 children. My aunt and her partner had to live in the smallest room of the house while my aunt looked for a job and a house to rent. Even with $85,000, she could not afford a house anywhere. After a month, my aunt's partner ran off after emptying her account. She was stranded at Sue's house without contributing anything because she spent all her earnings on bingo. Eventually, Sue and my aunt had a screaming match, and my aunt said something like, "I should have aborted you." Sue immediately threw her out of her house. So there was my aunt, in a city where she knew no one, with no money, homeless, and the last bridge she had burned to the ground. The last anyone heard of her, she was living in a caravan in the most dangerous part of the city and could not work anymore because she suffered from early arthritis and could not move her hands. I know I should not be happy that something like this happened to someone else, but it gives me some peace for what happened. Update. Hello everyone. About a year ago, I told you about how my aunt stole my inheritance and my siblings' inheritance, and I thought I would give a brief update but also wanted to respond and correct some things. I have tried to find my grandfather's war medals, but without his service number or death certificate, I cannot access his records. After learning that my cousin had taken and sold the medals, I searched local shops and Facebook groups for information but with no luck. I know he did not win any major medals. He was a mechanic and driver in the Royal Army, so fortunately, he had a fairly quiet war, so it would just be campaign and service medals. Someone specifically asked about the signing of the will, pointing out that my aunt could not have witnessed the will's signing due to laws preventing that. I do not know the full details of what she and my grandmother did, but her lawyer let slip that my aunt knew what was in the will before it was written. I just do not know the full details. I am ignorant when it comes to lawyers and stuff like that, and it was my older sister who read the will in full and relayed it to us. We asked if there was anything we could contest, but everyone we talked to said there was no case. Sorry if that was confusing. I have seen some comments on Reddit and in YouTube videos, which was weird to see this out in the wild, by the way, using a sheik to describe me. Well, I guess that is why people here now give their age and gender at the beginning of these stories, because I am a 32-year-old man, in case you were wondering. It did not bother or offend me, I just found it funny, haha. Someone asked what a caravan is. Here in the United Kingdom, we call them travel trailers. Think of a fiberglass or aluminum box on wheels. People in the United Kingdom use them for short vacations, and they are not fun to live in for extended periods. I have experience with this, and it was horrible. As for the update, when I left the story, my aunt had been abandoned in a big city and was stuck in a caravan with debilitating arthritis. Well, a few weeks after my first post, I got news that somehow she had found a new boyfriend. I do not know how, because my aunt looked and built like an obese pug, and that was when she was 30, so imagine what she looks like now in her 60s. She and her new boyfriend, I think I just threw up a little, decided to move to a coastal town and start a new life. Well, you can imagine what happened. The boyfriend must have gotten tired of her or found out she had no money, so he left her. During an argument with her landlord, she had a heart attack, and while in the hospital, she had another one. She has recovered, but she is even more disabled than before. The local council gave her a house, but do not worry because Clive has come to live with her. Oh my God, Clive. The walking disaster who sold my grandfather's medals and lost my aunt's house. That man is a walking episode of a Jeremy Kyle. Note from the editor, for those outside the United Kingdom, Jeremy Kyle was a sensationalist television show similar to Jerry Springer in the United States. After my aunt left my hometown, things began to look up for Clive. Someone took pity on him, haha, and he seemed clean and well. Despite everything that had happened, I was happy he was getting his life back on track. Well, it turns out he was not. They gave him a work van to go from job to job, and one day he showed up at work with a black eye and without the van. They found the van and a very confused man wondering why the police were arresting him. After interrogating him and reviewing a text exchange, they discovered that Clive had sold the van to the man and punched himself to make it look like a robbery. Clive was arrested. He was very lucky because his boss did not press charges. The boss told me afterward that he only did it out of respect for my grandfather, and all the police did was fine him for wasting police time. After spending all the money he had, he was homeless again. His only hope was his younger brother, let's call him Colin. Colin was in the armed forces and had a fairly high rank, from what I have heard. Colin was out of the house most of the time on missions, but they had managed to buy a nice house in our town. He let Clive live in his house on the condition that he paid part of the mortgage. You know where this is going. He stopped paying, stopped maintaining the house, and treated it like a drug den. Colin asked him to leave, but Clive used squatters' rights to avoid being evicted. Since Colin was overseas, he could not come back and fix it in person, nor did he have anyone in the area to wait for Clive to leave and change the locks. So Clive lived in the house for 6 months until an angry father broke in and beat up Clive. You see, the father had discovered that Clive, who is 41 years old, by the way, had been sending sexual messages and selling marijuana to a 13-year-old girl. After that, Clive left the house and ran to his mother's. From what I have heard, Colin has gutted the house and is selling it to move closer to his base. We found out about most of this from my aunt's daughter, Sue, the one who kicked her out. You see, my brother was on vacation in Turkey, and it turned out he was in the hotel room next to Sue. She apologized a lot to my brother and thought we would like to know what had happened. She seems to have a nice life and family now and no longer lives in the house she shared with her mother. I am genuinely happy for her, although I do not think I will try to repair our relationship. Sue had said some malicious things in particular and never reached out to apologize. Maybe I still feel a bit bitter about that. As for my aunt, I do not know how to feel. I hope she gets better and has the courage to kick Clive out, since he will only bring her more trouble. In some ways, I wish I could rebuild a relationship with her. She is the last living link to my grandfather and grandmother, as well as my mother's only living sister. But I know I could never trust her. I will never stop seeing that face and the malice she had towards me and my family. She chose the money, or what she thought was money, over us, and I do not think I can forgive that. But I will not intentionally harm her anymore. I am just happy to be in a better place now.